Okay, good morning. Welcome to the opening of the Vienna Circle exhibition at the University of Warsaw. We are very pleased to welcome our guests both on-site and our guests online. Thank you for joining us for the lectures that will commence shortly, and then later on the official opening of the exhibition at the University of Warsaw Library. I would like to welcome Vice Rector Sambor Grucha from the University of Warsaw to welcome our guests for the exhibition.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, I am pleased to welcome you at the University of Warsaw to celebrate the opening ceremony of the exhibition, the Vienna Cycle, Exact Thinking in Demented Times, which is an initiative of our Central Alliance. Central is a vivid partnership between 5 Central European universities: Charles University in Prague, ELTE University in Budapest, Humboldt University in Berlin, University of Vienna in Vienna, and University of Warsaw in Warsaw. Under the central umbrella, diverse research and outreach activities take place. One of them is just the traveling, as we call it, exhibition, the Vienna Cycle, Exact Thinking in Demented Times. The exhibition was organized at the University of Vienna, and it was already hosted at Charles University. Next stop is now University of Warsaw. Thanks to the enormous commitment of Professor Anna Brożek, the exhibition was extended to include the connection between the Vienna Cycle and the Lvov-Warsaw School. As said, the opening ceremony is divided into 2 parts. The first part consists of 4 lectures, which will be given by Professor Stadler and Professor Zygmunt from the University of Warsaw, further by Professor Brożek and Professor Osiewicz from the University of Warsaw. The second part is the official opening of the exhibition. The exhibition will run from January 28th to until February 28th and will be displayed at the University of Warsaw Library. I would like to thank everyone who helped organize the exhibition at the University of Warsaw. Many thanks to Professor Anna Brożek, Faculty of Philosophy, to Agnieszka Kościelniak-Osiak, University of Warsaw Library, and Klementyna Kielak, International Relations Office. Please say also thank you to you teams. Unfortunately, my colleagues, vice rectors from Central Alliance, couldn't come to the opening ceremony. I greet them cordially. I am pleased to welcome His Excellency Mr. Andreas Stadler, Ambassador of the Republic of Austria in Poland. Welcome. Ms. Gudrun Hardiman-Polros, Director of the Austrian Kultur Forum in Warsaw. Welcome. Dr. Martin Krispan, Director of the Office, Warsaw, Poland. Professor Gabor Lakci, Director of the Center of Hungarian Culture in Warsaw. I don't know if she is still with us, perhaps later. And Dr. Barbara Good, Head of International Office, University of Vienna. Barbara, welcome to Warsaw. I am also pleased to welcome my colleagues from the University of Warsaw. Hello to everyone in this room, and hello to everyone who watches us online. Coming to the end, I wish all of us good time and intellectual fun. Thank you for your coming. Thank you for watching us. Thank you for your attention.
And now I would like to invite Dr. Barbara Good from the head of the International Office at the University of Vienna, Vienna, which currently coordinates the activities in the central network and also the origin of the exhibition itself, where the first exhibition was hosted and where it was prepared. So Barbara.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Many welcomes on behalf of the University of Vienna. My name is Barbara Good. I'm head of the international office. I'm very happy to be here today. To be quite honest, it's my first time in Warsaw and also at the University of Warsaw. I very much hope this is not the last time. Having seen this beautiful building, I'm sure to come back. I would like to thank you, Sambor Gruszka, Vice Rector for Cooperation and Human Resources, for your hospitality and for agreeing to host this exhibition. I would like to thank Klementina Kilniak, Deputy Head of International Relations Office, for your energy, for your drive, and also for your flexibility, and just making all of this possible. Thanks a lot. Also, my thanks go to Professor Anna Brożek from the Faculty of Philosophy, who curate at the University of Warsaw, who curated the exhibition here and added a part on the Polish context of the Vienna Circle. Thanks a lot to you. And then I have to give my thanks to Agnieszka Kościelnik-Osiak. My colleagues taught me 10 minutes ago, and I've already forgotten how to pronounce the name. So I'm very sorry about that, but thanks a lot to you. Is that you? Okay, all right. Thanks a lot. You're designer of the exhibition. Thanks a lot for adapting this beautiful exhibition to the beautiful room here on the ground floor of the library. And of course, my thanks also go to Professor Friedrich Staffel and Professor Carl Sigmund, who are the original curators of the exhibition and who are here today as well, and who are going to give presentations focusing on the various links of the Vienna Circle to Poland. Thanks a lot for being here too. The Vienna Circle exhibition was shown in 2015 for the 650th anniversary of the University of Vienna, and I'm very, very happy that it has found a second life now within the central network. As Sambor Gruszka said, it was shown in October, November at the University of Prague. It's now being shown here in Warsaw, and it's going to travel to Berlin and Budapest. Perhaps not in that order, I'm not quite sure yet. But anyway, that is really one of our first achievements in the second phase of the central network. The exhibition focuses on the work and also on the aftermath of the Vienna Circle. As you all know, the Vienna Circle had an immense impact on science, on how we think about science. Concepts that were developed by the Vienna Circle are quite everyday for us, but that wasn't the case, of course, 100 years ago. But the Vienna Circle exhibition also shows the aftermath of the Vienna Circle, what happened to the members, many of whom were Jewish, in the 1930s, mid to end of 1930s. Most of them were either murdered or had to emigrate. And for me, to be quite honest, that was one of the most impressive parts of the exhibition when I saw it for the first time in Prague. I think it's very important for the University of Vienna to remember what happened in those times. And I also think that we have to take responsibility for it. As far as I know, we took a while to do that. We need to be aware that this can happen again in different settings, in different contexts, perhaps to a different extent, but we all know that academic freedom is increasingly under threat worldwide. So for me, this exhibition is also a reminder of what happened and what can happen, and thanks a lot for being here. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What an honor for me to start this session. My name is Barbara Grodetska, and I am the Central Network Coordinator from the University of Vienna. It is a great pleasure for me to be here, and I want to join everyone who've spoken before me in thanking those who made this event possible. I will briefly introduce Central Network to you. I know that most of us in the room know it very well already, but I'm glad to have the chance to show it to those who watch us online or to those who maybe not, who are not familiar with it. The main reason why we are here is obviously the brilliant exhibition about the Vienna Circle. But we wouldn't be able to show it here in Warsaw if it wasn't for the network of 5 leading research universities located in Central Europe. As Professor Grucha said already, the University of Warsaw obviously is a part of the network, as well as Charles University in Prague, ELTE Budapest, the University of Vienna, and Humboldt University in Berlin. There have been many ties between these universities in the past, and obviously there are a multitude of ways in which researchers from these institutions cooperate today. But I believe that Central is more than most of the other frameworks, and it is more because it is not just a technical agreement. It represents a particular idea, an idea of a shared intellectual space, of the importance of regional cooperation, and of a specific scientific research area. The process of putting this idea into action was initiated by the Humboldt University in Berlin in 2014 with the generous support from the ARD, which provided us with the funding for the initial phase. And since then, there have been dozens of events, lectures, workshops, cultural events, and many other summer schools and what have you, organized within the Central Network. All the universities involved were so satisfied with this cooperation that they decided to extend the funding beyond the original timeline. In the meantime, the University of Vienna has taken over the role as the coordinator, which will later rotate between the partners. From the very beginning, our main objectives were to strengthen the cross-border research collaboration, to establish new research networks and consolidate existing ones, to promote early-stage researchers and provide a setting for internationally oriented academic careers, and to enhance the visibility of Central European academic discourse. Those aims continue to be at the heart of all of our initiatives. However, we want to reach to the public, and we want to position ourselves as a hub of knowledge and a network of excellence for Central Europe. Our flagship projects are PhD mobilities, cultural events, and staff trainings, and most importantly, joint workshops. And we currently have an open call for workshops, which you can find on our website. And I warmly encourage everyone to have a look at the website and have a look at the materials that we publish there. If anyone would like to engage with the network, you will find all the necessary contact details on the website. Please don't hesitate and reach out to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And this year, the annual theme for the Central Network is Central Europe, what unites and what divides us. And there's nothing more that unites us than our shared intellectual legacy. Vienna Circle is for sure an example of that, and the connections that we find at each of the partner universities between the local universities and the Vienna Circle. Our first speaker on the Vienna Circle is Professor Friedrich Stadler from the University of Vienna. Professor Stadler is professor of history and the philosophy of science. And what is especially important to us that he's the founder, the longtime director, and now a permanent fellow of the Institute of Vienna Circle, located within the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Vienna. So he is responsible for maintaining the legacy and continuing research on the Vienna Circle and its repercussions on the intellectual life of the continent. So Professor Stadler, if we could possibly ask you to the stage. Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues and friends, representatives of the University of Vienna and Warsaw, thank you for enabling this exhibition on the hard circumstances too. And thank you for all collaborators who made it possible that we are performing this morning and the possibility of opening our exhibition from Vienna. I'm pleased that the ambassador of Austria is present here and the director of the Austrian Cultural Forum too. Let me begin with a short introduction on what is the subject of our exhibition and today's lectures. The Vienna Circle, obviously the Vienna Circle of Logical Empiricism and the Lvov-Warsaw School of Logistic Anti-Irrationalism were parts of European philosophy of science and are certainly the most important currents of modern analytic philosophy of science. Apart from this uncontested historical fact, there remains the question of the direct and indirect influence, reception, and topicality of these scientific communities in contemporary philosophy of science in general, as well as in the philosophy of the individual sciences, covering the formal, cultural, and social sciences. Between the wars, the so-called Schlick Circle interacted with related European philosophical centers, Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, Paris, Cambridge, Helsinki, Budapest, of which the communication with the Lvov-Warsaw School was for a long time an underrated but the most important exchange for both sides as a manifestation of a family resemblance. In parallel, the dissolution, destruction, and forced migration of these typical European schools, latest with the beginning of World War II, was a common fate leading up to a break as well as transformation of their programs. This process can also be described and analyzed with a focus on the question whether we can speak of a genuine Central European philosophy of science or rather of a philosophy of science in Europe. So let me try a short general comparison of these both currents regarding their mutual influences as seen from Vienna and characterize both currents in the European context up to the present after the linguistic, historical, and pragmatic turns. My colleague Karl Sigmund will focus on the significant topic of mathematics and logic in this process. I am pleased that Anna Brożek, with whom we enjoy a long-term cooperation, which began already with Jan Wolensky in the early 1990s in the Polish Cultural Institute in Vienna, by the way, will illustrate this issue also from a Polish point of view, based on her excellent addition to our Vienna Circle exhibition to be open today, where these bilateral and international developments are documented with a lot of charts. And I am pleased that Professor Aydukievich will contribute a separate lecture on the topicality of the Vienna Circle in law. We are speaking of two schools, two currents. And let me introduce to you shortly these philosophical movements. As you see, the Vienna Circle has a certain history in the prehistory before World War I. It was continued after the war with the so-called Schlick Circle, and, which is most important, it was accompanied by a lot of peripheral circles, like Karl Menger's mathematical colloquium, Richard von Mises' circle, the Wittgenstein group, Popper and the Vienna Circle, and Heinrich Gomperz. But what is most important for this cultural phenomenon, it was based and embedded in the Viennese cultural movement, like the Ernst Mach Society and other currents of late Enlightenment in Red Vienna. This is the core group of the Schlick Circle, and as you see, more than 90% were forced to emigrate, latest by 38. We have a lot of guests in the Schlick Circle, invited by Schlick himself and other members. And if you look on these visitors, you get an impression of the most excellent scholars in philosophy and philosophy of science, of course including Polish philosophers. In parallel, the Berlin group formed, and it was a close cooperation between Hans Reichenbach and Moritz Schlick and Rudolf Carnap. And on the other side, here you see the key figures of the Lvov-Warsaw School. We have to discuss if this was actually a school. This is a special question. And most of these members came in contact with the Vienna Circle, were invited, contributed with lectures, and published in this book series and in the journal. But in order to understand this development, we have to look on a twofold tendency between the wars. The first one is the growing and increasing internationalization with conferences, publications, and especially the exchange, individual exchanges, a lot of traveling. And on the other side, the pressure, the disintegration in their home countries. So we can see the flourishing scientific communication on the one side, as you see it from this list, continued up to the outbreak of World War II, and the so-called disintegration of the Lvov-Warsaw School and the Vienna Circle in Vienna, Warsaw, and Lvov. It was not only one generation, the pioneers, as you see out there at the entrance, but we have at least 3 generations of philosophers, men and women, and a lot of guests who became later on most important scholars in their fields. If you see the list on the right side, from H.E. Ayer to Frank B. Ramsey, yeah, it is the who is who of philosophy of science. Now, we know there's a prehistory. The Lvov-Warsaw School, I have to excuse, was actually founded in Vienna by Kasumi Aydukievich, who studied in Vienna with Franz Brentano, and lived there, stayed there, published, and left in 1895 for Lvov, and there he founded the famous school later on. And from the beginning of the Vienna Circle after World War I, we can see this mutual interest and exchange which began by the mathematician Karl Menger in 1929. He visited Warsaw, continued by the invitation to task in the Schlick Circle 1 year later, Carnap in Warsaw with 3 important lectures, Łukasiewicz in Vienna twice, Leon Quistek. He was not actually a member of this school, but counts as an important contributor, and several fellowships of Polish philosophers in Vienna. And if we now look on the primary sources, the unpublished letters correspondence, you will see that Łukasiewicz and Tarski approached Schlick already in 1930, requesting research literature in German for Warsaw University. And I'm pleased that the library is here in the floor, available, the Austrian library. Then Schlick, later on, he appreciated, apparently, Łukasiewicz in 1935, asks for support of Karl Menger's appointment to a chair of mathematics and possible consequence for Kurt Gödel to be promoted to an extraordinary professorship. So the most important logician of the 20th century was not lucky in Vienna, and Karl Menger, the most important mathematician for this group, the mathematical colloquium, did not succeed in getting the chair after, I think, Wilhelm Wirtinger. As we know, these were rather unsuccessful attempts to get help from Warsaw. But with the beginning of the 1930s, we see the formation of the so-called Unity of Science movement with 5 congresses for the Unity of Science. And the promoter and pioneer of this movement, together with Carnap, was Otto Neurath. And if you have a look on his correspondence along with Polish philosophers, and in brackets you have the number of letters, it's an impressive exchange and approaching this Polish tradition. And it was continued by Carnap later on. It was one article invited by Neurath, an article by Kasumi Aydukievich. It is written in German, who created this strange terminology of der logistische Anti-Irrationalismus in Poland. So you see, it's a family resemblance, logical empiricism and logistic anti-irrationalism, but there shouldn't be an equation. And the family resemblance refer to basic methodological positions like against any form of irrationalism in favor of linguistic exactness and symbolic logic, with interest in semantics based on foundational research in the sciences, preferable deductive ones. This was a special focus, deductivism in the Polish school in logic, but also in philosophy of science. And the problem focus was on a meta-theoretical research followed by an interest in semantics. This is, in addition, a specific contribution of the Polish school, the semantic turn, which was realized mainly by Alfred Tarski afterwards. I wouldn't quote these passages, you can go through. But the consequences were really decisive. In the congresses for the Unity of Science and in the proceedings in the journal Erkenntnis, you will find a lot of discussion notes and bibliographies on members of the Lvov-Warsaw School, and in addition, increasing bibliographical notes on modern literature collected by Neurath and provided by Alfred Tarski. Alone, if you see the list of publications in the journal Erkenntnis, you can imagine the innovative aspects of this exchange. It ranges from the first contribution in 1934 to Roserand's description of Kodarbinski's philosophy, which was not very well known in Vienna, and the reason was that most articles and books were published alone in Polish language, so that the transfer was a little bit impaired in this regard. And in addition, most of the members of the Polish school contributed to the reports on the conferences and symposia, and there were heated discussions in it. I will try to focus on this issue in a conference later on in the middle of February. What were the commonalities, the differences, and what were the issues at stake. But Otto Neurath convinced his Polish colleagues, especially Tarski and Jan Łukasiewicz, who stayed on the advisory board of this Unity of Science movement. So last time in Prague, we dealt with the first Congress in Prague 29. And it's important that Polish philosophers were not present there, but in the reports, in the proceedings of this conference, Neurath provided already a description of the Polish school. Why? He had approached Tarski, and Tarski was willing to send him a long letter, in addition with bibliographical notes and a self-description of the Lvov-Warsaw School. And let me quote, it is here in German. There were two letters in German from Tarski to Neurath, and they were published in German and in English, and let me only quote these passages from this self-description. Tarski wrote, and Neurath took over this literally in the journal Erkenntnis. Almost all researchers who pursue the philosophy of exact sciences in Poland are indirectly or directly the disciples of Twardowski, although his own works could hardly be counted within this domain. In the Warsaw circles, two directions of research can be distinguished. The first direction of research comprises the mathematical logic, the foundations of mathematics, the methodology of deductive sciences, and the history of logic. This direction is represented in the first line by Łukasiewicz, one of the older pupils of Twardowski, and by Lesniewski, who studied in various German universities, among others under Cornelius, it's a neo-Kantian philosopher, and who made his doctorate in Lviv under Twardowski. I myself, Tarski, am a pupil of both of the men mentioned above. As to our pupils, one should name Dr. Lindenbaum, Pressburger, Sobocinski, and Weisberg. The last two have not yet published anything, but their results are cited in the communication of Łukasiewicz and myself. An older pupil of Łukasiewicz is Kopczynski, who has worked in Schröder's direction. The second direction of research comprises the theory of knowledge, the methodology of natural sciences, and the humanistic studies, as well as semantics. This direction is represented by Kotarbiński, who is likewise a pupil of Twardowski and partly of Łukasiewicz, and by Kotarbiński's pupils. Mrs. Ossowski, Ms. Hosiasson, Ms. Steinberg, and others. Between the two directions of research, there is a close mutual awareness, and the influence of mathematical logic on the representatives of the second direction is especially visible. And then he goes on with the bibliographical notes, and this correspondence was followed by a long letter in 1936 after the Paris Congress, where there was a heated discussion about the origins of semantics. who was the founder of semantics in Vienna or in Warsaw or in both metropoles. Now, the continuation was already described. The next Congress was in Königsberg without a participation, but with the famous result of Gödel. We will hear about it. And in Prague, 34, the preliminary conference, it was the first time a common presentation and discussion of Austrian and Polish philosophers. And afterwards, have a look on the participation only of the Polish philosophers in the congresses from Paris to Cambridge in 1939, and you see this exchange was continued immensely, and it was mainly Tarski who could stay in the States after the outbreak of World War II, and the invitation saved his life, actually. There is a contribution by the couple Pfefferman describing this adventurous emigration story. But because of the break of the war break and the political circumstances and the early death of Neurath, the movement was stopped after World War II. There was a reprint of 19 monographs, including, by the way, the most famous one of Thomas Kuhn. And as you see, Tarski and Łukasiewicz as members of the advisory board. Now, this will be the topic of Karl. But the triangle of Menger, Carnap, and the Polish connection is most important. It was a continuous discussion on logic, meta-logic, meta-language in Warsaw and in Vienna. And one can imagine that this high density of discussions and exchange contributed enormously to the further development of this modern discipline of philosophy of science, which Carnap called logic of science at the beginning. The mathematical colloquium was a group of experts from Austria and from all over the world, and it was published and republished. It is also your topic. One can certainly state that the road from syntax to semantics was immensely influenced by the Polish philosophers, especially Tarski, and Carnap profited a lot from this communication also after his migration from Prague to Chicago in 1936. So let me come to some figures which are not directly belonging to the Lvov-Warsaw School, but most important for Vienna and also, I think, for Polish philosophy. It is Rose Rand, born as Rosalia Rand in Lvov, and he came to Vienna, studied here under Schlick, and documented the conversations of the Schlick Circle and translated a lot of Polish texts. So she served as a mediator between Warsaw and Vienna, and she has a tragic sense of life because she did not succeed in the academic field in the long run. Another guy, mainly forgotten, is Marcel Natkin, a good friend of Gödel's, born in Lodz, and he did not succeed. He wrote his dissertation under Moritz Schlick and emigrated early to Paris, where he continued as a photographer. And this guy was important also for the Vienna Circle, Leon Christek, who developed or contributed to modern symbolic logic and exchanged with Russell before World War I. We have published one piece as referred to here later on. And it is a nice ending story that he contributed in the Schlick Circle, one of the last lectures entitled, it's a German publication, Die Überwindung des Begriffsrealismus. So he fostered the nominalist interpretation of philosophy of science, and here is only just a paragraph out from this brochure. Not to forget Ludwig Fleck, who became famous mainly in the field of sociology and history of science, but the prehistory is not very well known. Fleck approached Moritz Schleck for the publication of his famous book Entstehung und Entwicklung einer wissenschaftlichen Tatsache, and Schleck recommended it to Sprenger, who rejected it because it was not fitting into the profile. And it could have been that this famous book was also published at the periphery of the Vienna Circle. So we can see now that between the wars there was a flourishing exchange and interaction between Vienna, Warsaw, and Paris. And Paris was also a target of Polish philosophy and logicians. And we can speak of a French and a Polish connection. In this regard, I'm mentioning this because the inclination towards conventionalism in logic and language was a common feature of all these three schools. Let me come to a summary, a short summary. We see overlapping origins if we compare the Vienna Circle and the Lvov-Warsaw School in the European context. You have the beginning with Brentano, Mach, Twardowski, which were continued later on between the wars. Common was the explicit rationalism, or called anti-irrationalism, the preference for symbolic logic and logicism, and common was the feeling that they worked on the same, more or less on the same aims and methods. And we can see also that multi-perspectival, multi-interdisciplinary attitude, but also the multi-ethnicism and the fate of these strong both schools are given also with their Jewish origins. We have in both schools women of logical empiricism and anti-irrationalism, and some commitments to a scientific republic of scholars. But there were also differences. It's first of all the dominance of English language, which formed the later transfer and transformation of Vienna Circle to the Anglo-Saxon world, which was not so the case for the Lvov-Warsaw School. And we can see that in the Lvov-Warsaw School, of course, the continuation was impaired by World War II and communism, but there were similar hindrances, but the school could survive nevertheless, which was not the case for the Vienna Circle. And some general issues were the English as lingua franca already, and we see that in contemporary research there's an ongoing literature which is documented in the most recent publications. We did it in Vienna on Franz Brentano, and together the proceedings of the Lvov-Warsaw School in European culture. And I think that it is most important to see this European cultural context for these metropoles and for the specific contributions up to the present. We had earlier a network from which we profited along in Europe, European Philosophy of Science. And the exhibition in Vienna was another attempt to make clear the important international contribution of the Vienna Circle despite his tragic fate before World War II. And we are pleased to open this exhibition downstairs, and you're invited to join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Stadler. And now to move to the Warsaw connection, the Lvov-Warsaw School. And we have Professor Anna Brożek from the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw. She's also head of the Lvov-Warsaw School Research Center, which was founded at the Faculty of Philosophy in 2020. And the goal of the research center is to coordinate research into the tradition of the Lvov-Warsaw School and to maintain its legacy. So Professor Brożek, thank you very much.
Dear Mr. Rector, dear Mr. Ambassador, dear professors, dear guests from Vienna and from Warsaw, dear all that are watching us online. It's my honor and pleasure to take part in this opening of our exhibition. I was mentioned several times today as the person responsible for this Warsaw addition to this totality of our exhibition. I would like to stress that I could not do it alone. It was a collective work, and I would like to express my gratitude to all people that were involved in preparing the Warsaw part of exhibition, especially to Klementyna Kielak, Agnieszka Kościelniak, also to Marcin Laszkowski, that was responsible for graphic, artistic representation of our exhibition, and also to Professor Jacek Jadacki, who shared the content of his archives with me. And all these people made this Polish part of our exhibition possible. Well, the main part of the exhibition we are opening today was prepared in Vienna and presents in an attractive and accessible way the history and views of the Vienna Circle. I would like to add that this Vienna part was so beautiful and excellent that we had to work really hard in order to make our part equally good. In Warsaw, the exhibition was essentially enriched with the presentation of the relations between the Lvov-Warsaw School and the Vienna Circle. Why we thought that this addition is needed? Well, firstly, the mutual relations of both groups of analytic philosophy are simply very interesting. Secondly, there is still a need to remind that not only the Vienna Circle, but also the Lvov-Warsaw School contributed significantly to the development of philosophy in the 20th century. Out of two groups in question, the Lvov-Warsaw School and the Vienna Circle, it is the Vienna Circle that is much more commonly known in the world. It is the Vienna Circle that occurs in all textbooks and encyclopedias of philosophy, while the Lvov-Warsaw School is still often omitted in these general presentations. Speaking in language understandable for younger people, in Google search, there are 10 times more results for the term Vienna Circle than for the term the Lvov-Warsaw School. In particular, there are about 200,000 records for the Vienna Circle and only 20,000 for the Warsaw School. I would also risk a hypothesis that even in Poland, the Lvov-Warsaw School is less known than the Vienna Circle. It is an example of the attitude summed up in the Polish saying, cudze chwalicie, swego nie znacie. In German, it's something like that. Du lobst andere, du kennst deine nicht. which may be translated into English as "you praise the others, you do not know what is yours," or rather as "the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence." In my short talk, I will concentrate on the philosophical aspects of the relations between the Lvov-Warsaw School and the Vienna Circle. However, I will start from a little historical background, adding some comments to the content of Professor Stadler's lecture. Then I will focus on philosophy, presenting similarities and differences between the projects of philosophy provided by the Lvov-Warsaw School and by the Vienna Circle. In the next part, I'm going to explain the influences between the two groups, and I will end with some general remarks about the exact thinking and its significance also today. The presentation of historical background, I would like to start from emphasizing that in some sense the roots of both the Vienna Circle and the Lvov-Warsaw School are in Vienna. Just like Professor Stadler emphasized, Kazimierz Twardowski, the founder of the Lvov-Warsaw School, was born in Vienna in 1866. There he attended famous Gymnasium Theresianum and he studied philosophy just in Vienna. His teacher was outstanding Viennese philosopher Franz Brentano. Before Twardowski moved to Lvov and started his philosophical school in Galicia, he habilitated in Vienna and lectured there for 1 year as a private docent. It is interesting historical fact that the Lvov-Warsaw School was highly influenced by Brentanian spirit, while in Vienna, in the first decades of the 20th century, Brentano was almost completely forgotten. Brentano left Vienna the same year as Twardowski, in 1895. After that, the Brentano vacat was filled by a physicist and philosopher Ernst Mach. It was Mach's philosophy that inspired 30 years later Moritz Schlick, Otto Neurath and Hans Hahn to initiate the meetings of the Vienna Circle. It was Mach who became the patron of this movement. However, despite the fact that the common roots of both the Lvov-Warsaw School and the Vienna Circle were located in Vienna, the philosophy represented by the two groups developed differently. Let's now look at time and space of the activity of the Vienna Circle and the Lvov-Warsaw School. When we look at the map of Europe, we may see a triangle with three vertices in Vienna, Lvov, and Warsaw. We notice that they are located in the Central Europe. As long as languages are concerned, in the Vienna Circle, mostly German was used, it's natural, while in the Lvov-Warsaw School, mostly Polish, as the school was oriented at development of the Polish culture. By this simple observation, a certain stereotype may be broken, namely that the analytic philosophy is a British-American enterprise, while in the Central Europe it was Austrian-Polish project, with also other centers mentioned by Professor Stadler. The time frames of the Vienna Circle are the following. In 1924, Moritz Schlick, Otto Neurath and Hans Hahn started informal meetings of people interested in the scientific perspective of the world. Soon they were joined by Karl Menger and initiated contacts with many famous scientists of the epoch. In 1929, the manifesto of the Vienna Circle was published and the official phase of the existence of the circle began. Unfortunately, it lasted only a few years. Hahn died in 1934, Schlick was murdered in 1936. Neurath, Karnap, Menger were forced to emigrate. That's why the year 1936 is usually indicated as the end of the circle. Of course, I mean only this circle sensu stricto. Professor Stadler was talking about the circle in the broader sense. The history of the Lvov-Warsaw School starts almost 3 decades earlier. In 1895, Twardowski began lectures in Lvov and soon opened his philosophical seminar there. In 1904, Twardowski initiated the Polish Philosophical Society in Lvov. The society was very active and had its 100th meeting in 1910. 1 year later, in 1911, the journal Ruch Filozoficzny, Philosophical Movement, started to be published. In his 35 years career in the University of Lvov, Twardowski promoted 47 doctors of philosophy. Most of them were very talented. 20 of them became later professors of philosophy, psychology, and logic. By the way, 10 of them were female. This is how Twardowski's effort gave rise to the great philosophical school. Twardowski started his activities when Lvov was the capital of Galicia, the Polish province of the Austro-Hungary Empire. The more intensive development of the school could take place after Poland regained independence in 1918. Already in 1915, Jan Łukasiewicz, Twardowski student, got the chair in reopened Warsaw University. Soon he was joined by other Twardowski's pupils, Stanisław Leśniewski, Tadeusz Kotarbiński, Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz, Władysław Witwicki. The school of Twardowski gained the second Warsaw branch. The Warsaw logicians initiated the cooperation with Warsaw mathematicians and the famous Warsaw School of Logic, whose results soon became world-famous achievements started. For the Lvov-Warsaw School, the interwar period was the phase of great prosperity. Unfortunately, this rapid development was stopped by the outbreak of the Second World War. Among historians of philosophy, there is no agreement as to the fact whether the Lvov-Warsaw School was ended with the outbreak of the war, or if the war was only a tragic break. What we may say, this collapse of the Warsaw School was caused by two totalitarian countries, the Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. One more comment has to be made when presenting the background of the two philosophical projects. Not accidentally, the terms circle and school are used in names of both formations. The Vienna Circle was a philosophical circle, and the main relation between its members was the relation of, let's call it so, fellow. On the other hand, the Lvov-Warsaw School was a school. The central relation between the members was the relation teacher-student. Suffices to say that many of Twardowski's students gave here their works written long after receiving doctorates for assessment. To the school, Kazimierz Twardowski, his students and students of his students are included. Twardowski treated the process of teaching philosophy very seriously. All his students got very well training in systematic philosophy. A special focus was on logic and psychology, as well as in the history of philosophy. However, the most important educational aim in the Lvov-Warsaw School was to teach how to think independently. Perhaps because of that, the school produced so many great original philosophers. Łukasiewicz, Kotarbiński, Dąbska, and other members of the school were equally talented teachers and continued Twardowski's initiatives. Now we finally move to philosophy. Kazimierz Twardowski used to say that he did not like the labels given to philosophical currents, as they simplify the matter too much and polarize some attitudes which are not so much alien. I fully agree with Twardowski. However, in this short presentation, I cannot avoid to use some labels and simplifications. The label used in order to describe the philosophy of the Vienna Circle are neo-positivism or logical empiricism. Generally speaking, the members of the Vienna Circle they were impressed by the results of science and mathematical logic, and they believed that sciences provide the only picture of the world, and that the task of philosophy may be limited to the analysis of the language and the logical structure of formal and natural sciences. The introduced verificationist theory of meaning, according to which only these sentences are meaningful, which are empirically verifiable. From this point of view, they criticized metaphysics, understood as something beyond scientific experience. They considered many philosophical problems as meaningless. They sharply distinguished a prioral logic, which they understood as a set of tautologies, from a posterior natural sciences based on experience. Furthermore, they introduced the thesis or the postulate of the unity of science, namely the thesis that all sciences may form a homogeneous unity, or at least that all scientific theses may be expressed in one common language. Methodology of science, the problem of foundations of sciences, and the problem of scientific language were the central areas of interest in the Vienna Circle. Of course, these initial views of the Vienna Circle underwent deep evolution. However, in this initial form, this program of philosophy was rather radical or even destructive for some areas of philosophical investigations. Let's now look at the program of the Lvov-Warsaw School. The Lvov-Warsaw School is characterized by common methodological ground, and the focus on detailed analysis of problems, respect to the results of various sciences, the use of broadly understood logical tools, and finally the postulate of clarity and exactness of language and the requirement of justification or accepted thesis. There were two main branches of the school: descriptive, psychological, which evolved into semiotic direction, and logical, influenced by rapid development of mathematical logic. Some members of the Lvov-Warsaw School balanced between these two paths. We may call this branch a central one. The project for philosophy in the Lvov-Warsaw School was interdisciplinary. The general attitude of the school is often called anti-irrationalism. This term, invented by Kasumi Aydukievich, became the label for the Lvov-Warsaw School philosophy. An anti-irrationalist is someone that opposes irrational convictions, methods, and actions. In philosophy, an anti-irrationalist opposes unclear language and unjustified speculations. In the Lvov-Warsaw School, philosophical problems were considered as meaningful and, in some cases, also resolvable. They used conceptual analysis, the method of paraphrase, and axiomatization to analyze and resolve these problems. The results of the logical branch of the Lvov-Warsaw School soon became famous. I mean, Łukasiewicz revalued logic, Leśniewski's formal system, Starski's logical semantics. Some conceptions of the logical branch are quite similar to the Vienna Circle approach. I mean, Łukasiewicz's program of logicization of philosophy, Aydukiewich's views on science and language, and Kotarbiński's realism. The similarities and differences between the two programs for philosophy sketched here may be presented as follows. There are, of course, some similarities. I mean the view of philosophy and science. Philosophy should respect the result of sciences. Philosophy versus logic. Philosophy should make use of logical tools. There were common areas of interest analyzed in both centers in Lvov and Warsaw and in Vienna. I mean methodology of sciences and the theory of language. However, I would risk a hypothesis that the spectrum of interest in Lvov-Warsaw School was broader than in the Vienna Circle. And, of course, the attitude towards exact thinking, clarity, precision, exactness as universal values in science and in philosophy. But there were also some essential differences. The understanding of cognition was narrow in the Vienna Circle and broader in the Lvov-Warsaw School. The conception of meaning, while in the Vienna Circle they proposed the verificationism, which was not accepted in Poland, but some other conceptions were proposed as directival conception of meaning of Aydukievich, and logical semantics of Leśniewski and Tarski. Philosophical problems were considered meaningless in the Vienna Circle and meaningful and resolvable in the Lvov-Warsaw School. The distinction a priori and a posteriori was accepted in the Vienna Circle and refuted in Poland, and the postulate of the unity of science was accepted in the Vienna Circle and refuted by Polish scholars. As we may see, despite some obvious analogies, there are also significant differences in these philosophical programs. Let us, the members of the Lvov-Warsaw School and the Vienna Circle, speak for themselves. In their publications, Twardowski's students stressed that they do not accept the radical views of the Vienna Circle. This is the quotation from Kazimierz Aydukievich. I do not know any Polish philosopher who would have assimilated the material thesis of the Vienna Circle. The affinity between some Polish philosophers and the Vienna Circle consists in the similarity of the fundamental methodological attitude and the affinity of the problems analyzed. And Łukasiewicz followed Aydukievich in this statement. Professor Aydukievich was right, writing about logistic anti-irrationalism in Poland. He wrote that he did not know any Polish philosopher who would accept the material thesis of the Vienna Circle as his own. We are, it seems, too sober to do so. Here are the relations of two members of the Vienna Circle, Karl Menger and Rudolf Carnap, concerning their meetings with Polish logicians and philosophers. Karl Menger wrote, "It was not only the formal logical work of the Polish logicians that impressed me. I also noted that they were interested in philosophical problems similar to some discussed in the Vienna Circle, but they attacked them in connection with and partly on the basis of their exact logical studies. They always confined themselves to concrete questions and completely eschewed those vague generalizations which seemed to me to becloud some of the Vienna discussions in the late 1920s. And Carnap wrote about his visit in Poland. In private discussions, I talked especially with Tarski, Leśniewski, and Kotarbiński. I found that the Polish philosophers had done a great deal of thorough and fruitful work in the field of logic and its application to foundations problems. In particular, the foundation of mathematics, the theory of knowledge, and the general theory of language. the results of which were almost unknown to philosophers in other countries. I left Warsaw grateful for many stimulating suggestions and the fruitful exchange of ideas, which I enjoyed. The Warsaw supplement to the exhibition Vienna Circle, Exact Thinking in Demented Times, presents the intensive exchange of ideas between the Vienna Circle and the Lvov-Warsaw School, which took place especially between 1929 and 1936. Within this short period, Karl Menger and Rudolf Carnap visited Warsaw. Members of the Lvov-Warsaw School, including Tarski, Kokoszyńska, Dąbska, Auerbach, and Melberg, visited Vienna and attended the meetings of the Vienna Circle, as well as Menger's Mathematisches Colloquium. It also documents the meetings of both groups during the Philosophical Congress, including this mentioned by Professor Stadler in his talk, especially the congresses for the unity of sciences organized by the Vienna Circle. Finally, the correspondence between the members of both groups proves that the contacts were multi-leveled. What was the result of this exchange of ideas? Well, for the members of the Lvov-Warsaw School, the radical views of the Vienna Circle became a kind of contrasting background for their own moderate philosophical views. For the members of the Vienna Circle, the meeting with Polish philosophers and logicians became a stimulus for softening their initial quite radical positions. A hypothesis appeared that the reason for much less radical views of the Lvov-Warsaw School was the Brentanian-Twardowskian philosophical heritage. Finishing my talk, I would like to put the question: is the exact thinking promoted both in the Vienna Circle and in the Lvov-Warsaw School an important value also today? Well, my answer is an emphatic yes. The tendency towards clear, exact formulation of thoughts, the reflection over the sources of cognition, and the analysis of the content of our worldviews and of the justifications of the theses we accept should be a necessary element of everyone's education as well as any public activity. To firm this statement, let me quote two representatives of the Lvov-Warsaw School stating about the role of exact and critical thinking in our life. Jan Łukasiewicz: it is as if the scales fall from the eyes of whoever has educated themselves in the exact thinking of mathematical logic. They see differences when others do not, and they see nonsenses where others look for some mysterious depth. And Maria Osowska, a female representative of the Lvov-Warsaw School, a professor of Faculty of Philosophy, Warsaw University. To achieve intellectual honesty, criticism is necessary, a disposition which is being exterminated in totalitarian systems. A critical person is resistant to intoxication. Such a person stubbornly demands not intoxications, but justifications. It's a great task of scientific philosophy to develop and promote the exact and critical thinking, the task which may not be fully realized by more and more specialized natural sciences. It is worth to emphasize it whenever scientific philosophy is accused of being useless. Yes, it is useless and even destroying, but in totalitarian systems, it is a necessary element for every mature and sane society. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brożek. And now another one of our guests from the University of Vienna, Professor Karl Zygmunt. He will give a little bit of a different perspective, a perspective of a mathematician, as Professor Zygmunt is a mathematician himself, a leading expert on evolutionary game theory, and also with great interest in the history of mathematics, and especially the history of the relations between mathematicians connected to the Vienna Circle. Professor Zygmunt, together with Professor Stadler, curated the exhibition of the Vienna Circle in Vienna in 2015, the one that we have the pleasure of hosting in Warsaw now. So Professor Zygmunt, the floor is yours.
I have to apologize. I have never given a lecture sitting down, and I can't start today. I would like to begin with a Polish mathematician who never met anyone from the Vienna Circle, but who is essential for the story. This is Zygmunt Janiszewski. He was born in Warsaw at the time when there was no Polish university in Warsaw. Normally people would go then to Krakow to study, but he went to Zurich, he went to Paris, he went to Göttingen, and he became a brilliant young mathematician working on the foundations of mathematics and on set theory. And in addition, he was an ardent patriot. He said we must put Poland back on the map. We have no state, but we have civilization, we have culture. This was in a tradition that goes back to the organic movement and to positivists in Poland. And he said that since Madame Curie had done the most things for the reputation of Poland since Frédéric Chopin probably, he would go on in this direction by doing science, and more precisely by doing mathematics, and by attracting and appealing to young people to study mathematics and to focus on one field of mathematics, namely on foundations of mathematics and set theory. It just so happened that he had been working on this field, but he said we should not split, we should concentrate on this field. When World War I broke out, he joined the Polish Legion, of course, and the basic idea was to first join the Central Powers to beat Russia, and then to join the Allies to beat the Central Powers. It was a bit more complicated, but essentially it succeeded. And after World War I, the Polish University in Warsaw reopened and opened, and Janiszewski, despite his great youth, was appointed professor there. He founded a journal, Fundamenta Mathematica, which was devoted to his fields, set theory and foundations of mathematics, and which became very quickly legendary. The first issue was only containing contributions by Polish logicians and mathematicians. Unfortunately, he died, not yet 33 years old, from Spanish flu in Lvov. But he had started what is can only be expressed as a supernova of Polish mathematics. And this is the background for the story I would like to tell. So Vienna Circle, there were essentially three mathematicians in the Vienna Circle. This was Hans Hahn and Karl Menger and Kurt Gödel. Hans Hahn has been considered as a true founder of the Vienna Circle. He was a mathematician from Vienna. He studied in Vienna, but also in Strasbourg and in Göttingen. He worked on a great many fields, but he was especially remarkable for his talent for attracting other people in discussions, and mostly on philosophical discussions on the philosophy of science. And so before World War I already, he founded a discussion circle which was called the Urkreis later. And as a major members of that circle were, next to Hahn, were the physicist Frank and the historian of economy Neurath. And when in 1911 Hahn was appointed to a professorship in Czernowitz, he said, okay, we have to give up our discussions now, but when I return to Vienna, he was sure that he would eventually return to Vienna, then we will resume our discussions on the philosophy of science with the addition of a university philosopher, because so far they had no philosopher in their little group, and they were only meeting in coffee houses. I should also mention that his sister, Olga Hahn, was a most remarkable scientist. She studied mathematics, and she wrote papers on mathematical logic. Unfortunately, she became tragically blind at the age of 22, but nevertheless, she kept working on logic, and she assisted to the meetings of the Urkreis and also later to the meetings of the Vienna Circle. Hans Hahn, from the beginning on, was very, very interested in philosophical questions. And this is a passage from a letter where he wrote to a colleague, "Last year I almost became unfaithful to mathematics, seduced by the charms of philosophy." But of course, a young scientist has, first of all, to make his name in his discipline. And this Hans Hahn certainly did. I mentioned that he became professor in Czernowitz, but when World War I broke out, Czernowitz was quickly overrun by Russian troops, and so he lost his job, he lost his house, he had to enter the army, he was severely wounded and invalidated out of the army in 1915. Then he became professor in Bonn. He was working on a great many fields, and one field in particular consisted in space-filling curves. This is a very intriguing phenomenon where you can show that it is possible with one curve to reach all the points in a square. This is a theorem of Hahn and Mazurkiewicz, because Mazurkiewicz independently obtained the same result. Hahn also worked on variational calculus and ordered groups in trigonometric series, on measure theory, and there is a famous theorem of Hahn and Sachs, and again Sachs obtained it independently. He was a Polish mathematician. And in functional analysis, Hahn did foundations of this extremely important field, but the main theorems are due to Hahn, to Banach and to Steinhaus, and Banach and Steinhaus again are Polish mathematicians. They were working on exactly the same field and obtaining more or less the same results. Particularly important is a theorem of Hahn and Banach, which is one of the most important theorems in mathematics at all, which says roughly that if you have two convex sets which are disjoint, then you can separate them by a plane. This seems absolutely obvious in 3 dimensions, yes? But Hahn proved that the same, and Banach proved that the same result holds also in all dimensions and even in infinitely high dimensions, infinitely many dimensions. And this is an extremely deep result. And Banach here acknowledged that actually Hahn had been the first one to reach this result. Banach didn't know this and rediscovered it by himself. So there was this parallelism, this intriguing parallelism between the mathematical work of Hahn and the mathematical work of these eminent Polish mathematicians. Well, in 1920, finally, Hans Hahn was appointed back to Vienna, and then he could start, of course, his old project of having this discussion circle on the foundations of science, on the philosophy of science. Otto Neurath was here too, and together they were looking for a university philosopher, and they managed to appoint Berlin-born Moritz Schlick to fill the job. And Schlick became the official head of the Vienna Circle. Hahn and Neurath were his companions, so to speak. And here it was the office of Hans Hahn in Strudelhofgasse, and in the lecture room next by, the circle met every second Thursday in the evening to discuss their problems. It happened that Karl Popper was also a student at the time, and he described Hans Hahn in actually the last paper that Karl Popper wrote in his lifetime. He was already, I think, 95 years old or so. He described Hans Hahn as an embodiment of mathematical discipline. Hahn gave seminars on the Principia Mathematica of Russell and Whitehead, which were so essential for the development of mathematical logic, and which inspired Carnap and Gödel, essentially. And so these are lecture notes of typical lectures of Hans Hahn. He was very important in bringing logic to the attention of the Vienna Circle. And it was only when he was 50 years old that Hahn, who had been interested from early youth on in philosophy, only when he was 50 years old, old. He started writing on philosophy. His first paper was these überflüssige Wesenheiten, superfluous entities, so to speak, and it attracted immediately the hostile attention of the press because Hahn had dared to criticize notions like the immortal soul or so, and this, of course, was not very popular in reactionary circles in Austria in the 30s. In 1934, a short but bloody civil war erupted, and the political climate changed radically. Independently of this, Hans Hahn fell ill, cancer, and he died this year. And this was particularly tragic for the evolution of the Vienna Circle because Hans Hahn, with his forceful personality, his strong and outspoken leftist views, would have been an essential force for the Vienna Circle. It was not going to be. The second mathematician about whom I want to speak is much younger. This is Karl Menger, who was born in 1902. He was actually the son of the famous economist Karl Menger, whose Karl is written with a C. He was the founder of the Austrian School of Marginalism in economy, very important school. And he also had ties to Poland because he was born actually in Novi Sad. And this young Karl Menger, the son, was an absolutely brilliant man, extremely talented in all fields. And the interesting thing is that his schoolmate was a son of Arthur Schnitzler, the most famous writer in Vienna at the time. And therefore we see in the diary of Arthur Schnitzler many remarks about this young man. And Arthur Schnitzler, for instance, at the time when Menger was 18 years old, wrote, "This is a talented young man, but he has bizarre and megalomaniac traits and suicidal ideas, and so it seems a bit strange." 7 years later, it was very different. He wrote that Menger is now a professor of mathematics at the university. He seems to enjoy Europe-wide reputation. I always feel his genius, and so on. So what has happened in between with this remarkable young man? The first thing is that this young man fell ill from tuberculosis. Vienna was at that time destitute and very poor, it was very cold. And so he had to spend almost 2 years in a sanatorium. But he had friends who sent them their lecture notes, and he had already made contact with Hans Hahn, who had sent him to work in topology, in set theory, and the idea of dimensions. So when Karl Menger completely recovered and returned to Vienna, he could pursue his work on curves, which was very important work. So he was one of the first to give a mathematically solid definition of dimension, which is really a 1,000 years old problem. Very famous is this Menger sponge, which is the most general curve, the most general one-dimensional thing that exists. Remarkably, in parallel again, and almost the same thing had happened in Poland. This was the Sierpinski gasket, which looks very close to the Menger sponge, isn't it? So this parallelism in the mathematical interests continued. This was not only reduced to Hahn. Menger was also working very much aware of the tremendous things that were going on in mathematics in Poland at the time. So in 1923, he was only 21 years old. Menger got his PhD. He was immediately one of the youngest members of the Vienna Circle, invited by Hahn, invited by Schlick. Then he went as a postdoc to study with the great Dutch mathematician Brouwer in Amsterdam, and then he returned. Age 26, he became professor of geometry at the University of Vienna. And in 1929, he was the first of this group from the Vienna Circle to visit Poland. And he initiated then, and we have heard this very well in the lecture by Anna Brožek, he initiated this extremely intensive exchange of ideas and mutual visits there. So he was both interested in his mathematical work, in topology, and there he very close contacts with Kuratowski, with Knaster, and I could mention many others, but he had also a side interest, if I may say, in logic, and there he had brought Chwistek, Leśniewski, Łukasiewicz, Tarski, especially Lindenbaum and others, to the attention of the Vienna Circle. And in particular, I mean, he made it possible for Tarski to visit Vienna very soon. I will speak about this a bit later, but right now just a parenthetical note that Menger writes, describes an interesting episode that happened at the Vienna Circle. Namely, they were discussing a statement of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was a great idol of some of the members of the Vienna Circle, although he himself never visited the Vienna Circle. But one of the statements of Wittgenstein was that logic, formal logic, could not work without parentheses. And the essential role of parentheses in logical notation had been overlooked so far. And then Menger stood up and said, this is not true at all. Łukasiewicz has shown that one can do logical notation without parentheses. This is the so-called Łukasiewicz or Polish notation, yes? And this created a big sensation in the discussions of the Vienna Circle because somebody had dared to criticize Wittgenstein. So this was maybe one of the reasons why some of the younger members of the Vienna Circle who were fed up with the infatuation of Moritz Schlick and also in a way of Hahn with Wittgenstein, these members did not leave the Vienna Circle, but made in addition their own kind of parallel circle. And this was a circle of younger men and women interested in, more interested in mathematics. And this was a Wiener Mathematische Kolloquium. And here is a picture of the young Menger, very much the hero and head of this group, and the journal which published the results of this Vienna Mathematical Colloquium, which really were path-breaking in topology, in logic, and in mathematical economy. Here is a member, Olga Tauski, a brilliant mathematician of the Vienna Circle and of the Mathematische Kolloquium. Here is Menger, here is Gödel, and here are some unknown visitors from the Far East. Here are Abraham Wald and Franz Alt, who both made their mark later. Both were students of Menger. Wald became a foremost statistician in the United States, and Alt one of the pioneers of computer technology. And both were writing very important works also in mathematical economics that still are often quoted today. But in 1933, the political tensions in Vienna became so drastic, and the university had to close down so much that Karl Menger withdrew for a time, a couple of months, from the university, because the university had to close down anyway because of the riots. And he wrote a mathematical booklet where he tried to come to grips with these tensions, these conflicts of interests within a society. He was thinking, could one possibly make a mathematics describing these conflicts of interest? And he wrote a little booklet which was called Moral, Wille und Weltgestaltung, which was published in the series of the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle was very interested in morals, despite the claim that morals is something you could not speak about. The book itself was not really important. It was somehow pathetic and could not address interesting questions. But it led Karl Menger's friend, Oskar Morgenstern, the economist, to think about this question. And later, 5 years later or so, Morgenstern, together with John von Neumann, was founding game theory. And game theory went then really to be a workable method of dealing with conflicts of interest, and hence with problems of law and with ethics, because law and ethics, there would be no need for this if there were no conflicts of interest. So this was also an indirect effect of Karl Menger's interests in social and economic questions. 1938, Karl Menger happened to be as a guest professor in the United States when there was the annexation of Austria. And he cabled immediately to Austria and said that he resigns from his job. During the war years, he was instructor at the US Navy. He gave 19 hours of lectures per week. So there was not much place for any research doing. But after the war, he became professor at the newly founded and ultra-modern Institute, Illinois Institute of Technology. The building is by Mies van der Rohe, and he ended his career very successfully there. It took a long time before he returned for visits to Vienna, but his ideas and his memories always circled around this time. And he wrote a book, Reminiscences of the Vienna Circle, which I think is a very important source book for what happened in the Vienna Circle, as seen from an interested but distant member of this group. And now the third one, Kurt Gödel. Only a few years younger than Karl Menger. Kurt Gödel was born in Brno in Czechoslovakia, from well-off parents. He studied after the First World War in Vienna. This was an obvious thing to do. And he studied, first I would like to show that this is his first attempt of doing mathematics. He was maybe 6 years old, and maybe the first contradictions in mathematics which he found at that time. But when he came to Vienna, under the influence probably of Hans Hahn and his seminar on the Principia Mathematica, he bought himself a copy of the Principia Mathematica, and he started working on this field between philosophy and mathematics that at this time was so extremely important. And he succeeded tremendously, and he was barely 25 years old when he made what is considered by many to be the most significant mathematical contribution in the 20th century. Namely, he proved roughly that there exists, in every formal system, there exist true statements that cannot be derived within the system. For 2,000 years, since Euclid, mathematics had said, okay, we start with axioms, these are statements that are given, they cannot be questioned, and from these, by a pure logic, we deduce consequences, which are theorems, which are proved. Yes? And he showed that this program would not work. No matter what axioms you choose, there would always be true results that could not be derived in this form in mathematics, which could not be formally proved within this system of axioms. This was an absolutely shattering result, and which had an enormous influence also for the development of what at the time, of course, did not yet exist, namely the development of computers, computer architecture, and so on. And here again, we come, here in the diary of Carnap, we see the first announcement. Yes, this was 1929, Café Reichsrat, in the coffee house, we prepare for a trip. Gödel's discovery, the incompleteness of the system of Principia Mathematica, difficulties of the consistency proof, a landmark in the history of human thought. And this is an excerpt of a discussion where Gödel, for the first time, during a discussion on mathematics, said that there exists mathematical theorems which are true, inhaltlich richtig, but could not be derived formally. And John von Neumann, the brilliant superstar of mathematics at the time, was extremely impressed. Gödel was someone who was thinking even faster than John von Neumann could think. And Gödel sent to John von Neumann the manuscript of the page proofs of his breathtaking article. And John von Neumann was completely convinced that here he was facing a genius of the first order. Another one who was deeply impressed by this was Alfred Tarski. Tarski had been working on very parallel lines and had actually in 1929 had a really amazing idea close to what Gödel had done, that truth could not be formalized within a mathematical system. But he missed one essential gap in the proof. He could not finish his proof. And then he heard, from Menger probably, that Gödel had found this result. And so he visited Vienna. Tarski went to Vienna, gave 3 lectures in Vienna. Here we see him standing next to Kurt Gödel. It was in February and rather cold. And from then on, Gödel and Tarski were in close correspondence. During the 30s, Kurt Gödel kept on doing important work, but he was suffering from psychological problems. And so he was commuting more or less between, on the one hand, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and on the other hand, nervous sanatories in Vienna. But in between, in his better periods, doing very important work on set theory and mathematical logic. And in particular, he showed the landmark results, independence of the continuum hypothesis, the consistency of the continuum hypothesis. This is a very, very important problem in set theory. And my own professor Lafka told me that in 1938, Gödel gave a lecture course, 1 semester, on this set theory, and there were only 2 in the audience who listened. There were only 2 students present, and Gödel. Namely, the other student was not really a student, but already a well-established postdoc from Poland, namely the famous set theoretician Mostowski. But Gödel did not really care about how many students were in the audience. He always turned their back to them and wrote on the blackboard without ever looking over his shoulder. And so he was not very good at lecturing, but his mathematical ideas were absolutely fundamental. In 1940, the war had already broken out already. In the January of 1940, he managed, together with his wife Edil, to leave Nazi Germany. He managed to do it by going in the wrong direction. Through Poland no longer existed. It had again been erased by Nazis, and communists had split the country again. He went through Soviet Union, Japan, the Pacific Ocean, to the United States and to Princeton, and he never left Princeton after that. He met Morgenstern in Princeton, and in the diary of Morgenstern we see how Gödel came from Vienna via Siberia and so on. And in this time, Gödel became a very close friend with Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was 25 years older and looked upon Gödel somehow like his son. He was very kind, and every day they had long discussions during long walks, and nobody knows exactly what they were discussing, but it led, among other things, to Gödel's interest in the theory of relativity. And he showed, again this is noted in the diary of Oskar Morgenstern, Gödel showed that the field equations of Einstein permitted in principle time travel into the past. which is of course absolutely paradoxical, because by traveling into the past you can change the causality. You can, as Gödel said, you could, for instance, do something to your younger self, and then this self could no longer engage on a time travel. So it was completely mad. But it was compatible with the best established physical theory at his time, namely, and still today, yes, a big riddle in general relativity theory. Here I jump forward. This is in the 60s, a picture of Alfred Tarski and Kurt Gödel. This is, I showed you a picture before. This one is more than 30 years later. Alfred Tarski was now a highly established professor in Berkeley. And Kurt Gödel, of course, was also a legend in Princeton. And Gödel used Tarski used to joke that, okay, Gödel was the greatest mathematician of his time, but Tarski was the greatest sane mathematician, sane logician of his time. Gödel was more and more suffering from delusions and depressions, but he wrote very much, and in particular he wrote again and again that the Vienna Circle, and Wittgenstein in particular, had no influence on his mindset, on his ideas, that he was independent of the Vienna Circle. And indeed, his ideas were fitting much more with the ideas of Leibniz or some Baroque logicians, rather than with avant-garde ideas of the 20th century that could be found in the Vienna Circle or in Princeton or in Poland. So Tarski, in some sense, was much more doing the logic in the sense of the Vienna Circle than Kurt Gödel did. I end this slide with a picture of what has been called the greatest intellectual friendship since Plato and Socrates. This was Albert Einstein and Kurt Gödel during one of their daily long walks in Princeton, and with a statement that Kurt Gödel said himself that he viewed his work not as an intellectual facet of the 20th century, rather the contrary. He was like someone from another world. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zygmunt, for the mathematical perspective. And now we will move to a legal perspective on the legacy of the Vienna Circle. And we have Professor Joanna Osiejewicz, a professor at the Faculty of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warsaw, head of the Department of International Legal Communication, and Vice Rector's Proxy for International Cooperation.
Dear sirs, many thanks to Mrs. Grodetska for this very kind introduction, and I would also like to thank Rector Gucza for inviting me here and give the possibility to take part in this amazing event. In my speech, I will address the question of what open texture is, how it is applied in legal doctrine, and how open texture determines the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights as a living instrument. I will explain this problem on the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. The starting point of my reflections was the concept of open texture of terms formulated by Friedrich Waismann. Friedrich Waismann was a student of Moritz Schlick and a member of the Vienna Circle. In principle, he accepted the vision of the language adopted in this group and considered the definition as the basic method of characterizing concepts. Waismann was a perfectionist philosopher who chased after his ideas. He published relatively little, retaining again and again to the ideas previously presented in his lectures or philosophical discussions. That's why it is sometimes difficult to determine the exact date of origin of some of his concepts. This also applies to the concept of open texture of terms. Weismann presented it for the first time at a symposium on verifiability and published it in 1945 in the original version. The paper was then published in an editorial version in 1951 entitled Verifiability, and since then has been widely known and discussed. The sources of the Weismann concept of open texture should be sought, however, in the constructivist view on language that Ludwig Wittgenstein had in mind, presented in the 40s. So in general, one can say that the concept of open texture contained in the paper Verifiability is a creative development of ideas that Wittgenstein had in mind before. In the characterization of Friedrich Weismann's concept, attention should be paid to three elements. Firstly, open texture in Weismann's view is a feature only of empirical terms such as cat or gold, and as Weismann points out, of the most, if not all, of such concepts. He states that the open texture attribute does not refer to non-empirical concepts, such as concepts in the field of mathematics or geometry, for instance, the notion of a triangle, or concepts related to games, for instance, chess. Secondly, Weismann insists that the open texture of empirical concepts, as he understands them, is fundamentally different from vagueness. The main difference lies in the fact that the vagueness as a feature of some empirical concepts, such as heap or ping, can be eliminated by appropriate definition measures that clarify the rules for the use of a particular term. By contrast, open texture is an indispensable feature in the sense that subsequent definitions of the empirical content can always be corrected. Thirdly, open texture reveals itself and refers to the use of empirical terms in extremely unusual or unforeseen situations, and even those for which we do not even allow for the possibility that they may occur. For example, Weismann considers an imaginary situation in which the open texture reveals that if an animal that has all the characteristics of a cat and behaves like a cat has suddenly grown to a gigantic size, one would still say that it is a cat. Or if a substance that looks like gold and positively passes all the chemical tests for gold would emit an unknown kind of radiation, would we still call it gold? So although such situations do not occur, they are potentially possible, and that, according to Weismann, is enough to show that we can never completely rule out the occurrence of an unforeseen situation in which we have to change the definition of the term. At this point, it is necessary to answer two questions about the basic, if not entirely clear, ideas of Weismann. So firstly, what is the fact that the open texture of terms that function properly and typical normal situations manifests itself in extreme, unforeseen, or even unpredictable situations? And secondly, what is the specific infinity of open texture that manifests itself in the fact that even if we modify the given term to function properly in an extreme situation, we can never be sure that the next extreme situation do not occur, which we could not foresee and in which the modified term will fail, and so ad infinitum. To answer these questions, it is necessary to consider the basic idea of the Weismann's concept in such a way that it does not even refer to attributes of the empirical concepts themselves, but rather to the relation of these concepts to external knowledge. It may be that these attributes are in no way related, and there may be a certain relationship between certain attributes. For example, some attributes always coexist, and other attributes never coexist. That is, there is that or this other attribute. Of course, our knowledge, that is a series of statements that we believe to be true, is about the relationship between one or the other attribute only for a particular moment. It may be that the statement about the relations between the considered attributes, which is peculiar to our knowledge of a given moment, because we then regard it as correct, is no longer peculiar to our knowledge from another moment, because we then claim this assertion for mistaken. Therefore, we can never be sure that our knowledge of the relationships between the considered attributes contain only true assertions, and that we know all relations between different attributes. That is, we never have absolute knowledge in this area. In addition, it must be considered that the relationships between the attributes may change. So it may be, for example, the case that attributes necessarily coincide at some point in time, while at another point in time, such a relationship no longer exists. Our knowledge of these relationships may be also subject to revision. So on the one hand, because these relationships may change, and on the other hand, because while these relationships not change, we may view our previous knowledge as false. The problem can be illustrated with the linguistic content of the term mother. So to date, there has been consensus that the mother of the child is firstly human, secondly female, thirdly who gave birth to a child, and fourthly the child was produced from mother's ovum. It was simply not possible for a woman not to give birth to a child from her ovum. Now it is possible. This raises a problem of who the mother of such a child is. The woman who gave birth to the child, albeit not with her ovum, or the woman from whom the ovum was taken, but who did not give birth to the child, or maybe none of them, because none of them has all the qualities that every mother has had so far. Now, in the light of Weismann's theory, the question arises, which linguistic conceptual content is currently called mother? First, we must think about which attributes belong to the linguistic content of the term mother, the third or the fourth, or only one of them, and if so, then which one? If the linguistic content includes attributes 3 and 4, then if the meaning of the term mother was not changed, then one should assume that the child born of a woman from the ovum of another woman does not have a mother. But of course that would be unacceptable from a moral point of view. That's why we must decide whether the content of the term mother should in future include attributes 1, 2, and 3, or alternatively 1, 2, and 4. Now we can also explain why the open texture is particularly infinite. Even if we review a particular situation and adapt it to our updated knowledge, we can never assume that our updated knowledge will not require future updating that calls for further revision of the linguistic content. We can never assert that our knowledge is completely true. If we defined a child's mother as a woman who gave birth, so based on this definition, the linguistic content of the term mother will include the following attributes. Firstly, human, secondly, female, thirdly, gave birth to a child. But when the possibilities of human intervention in the processes of conception and development of pregnancy continue, it is not excluded that soon a child will be born, which is conceived in vitro, and the entire development process takes place outside the woman's body, for example, in a special incubator. Who will be then the mother of such a child? Given the assumed definition, the child will not have a mother. The question is also whether it is even possible to say that such a child was born, since it could only be taken out of the incubator as a self-sufficient life. Let us also point out that the definition assumes that there is a necessary connection between the attributes 1 and 3, which means that a human being can only be born by another human being. And if this correlation is broken, if genetic manipulations are allowed, and a human is born from the ovum of a woman that is put into the womb of a chimpanzee, who will be then the mother of such a child? So here we are dealing with situations analogous to Weismann's, that is situations that do not happen, but it is not excluded that they may happen in the future. So there are situations in which fundamental claims of our knowledge must be rejected. There is probably no other legal doctrine that better reflects the understanding of open texture than the living instrument doctrine. It applies to the European Convention on Human Rights and means that the convention is to be interpreted in today's terms. The so-called evolutionary interpretation refers to the effective understanding of the open texture of the convention in the light of contemporary social and cultural concepts. The convention should be an instrument of development and improvement, and not a final treaty that has frozen the situation that existed 70 already years before. But the European Court of Human Rights needs to find a balance between development and stability. Through this balance, the court must meet two objectives at the same time. So firstly, to maintain the practical and effective nature of the convention, and secondly, to ensure acceptance and national implementation of judgments by the state parties to the convention. So the court uses this living instrument approach to procure the autonomy of convention rights, not from national definitions and classifications, but from different moralistic views. By moralistic, I mean views that dictate that someone should be deprived of freedom or opportunity just because others, usually the majority, consider them less than equal or do not care about them. The living instrument approach first appeared in Tyrol in the judgment of 1978. The court had to decide whether judicial corporal punishment for young people is a degrading punishment under Article 3 of the Convention. Mr. Tyrol, then aged 15, was given 3 strokes of a birch. Birching was conducted by a policeman in private in the presence of Tyrol's father and a doctor. Tyrol was made to take down his trousers and underpants and bend over the table. The punishment imposed on a naked body by a police officer at a police station was required by law and practiced on the Isle of Man, a dependent area of the United Kingdom with a considerable degree of legal autonomy. At that time, the corporal punishment in the rest of the United Kingdom was already abolished and not found in most other contracting states. In his remarks, Attorney General of the Isle of Man argued that judicial corporal punishment could not be considered degrading since it did not outrage public opinion on the Isle of Man. The court challenged this argument and noted that public acceptance of judicial punishment itself cannot mean that the punishment is not demeaning and that in the fact the opposite could be the case. The reason why people advocate a particular kind of punishment is probably the fact that they find it humiliating and that it can therefore act as a strong deterrent. The court found that in assessing whether a particular punishment is inappropriate, all the circumstances of the case and the nature of the context of the punishment itself and the way it is enforced must be observed. So the court drew a contrast between what public opinion thinks about corporal punishment and what the true nature of this punishment is. They added also that the convention is a living instrument that must be interpreted in the light of today's conditions. The court based its decisions directly on substantive considerations and did not provide detailed evidence of any developments and generally recognized legal standards in Europe. So it found that this punishment means that one person inflicts physical violence on another person and that it is an institutionalized attack on the dignity and bodily integrity of a person, which is currently being protected under Article 3 of the Convention. The court further added that the institutionalized nature of this punishment, the fact that this is inflicted on the offender by complete strangers, and the fact that it is administered on a naked body contributes to the punishment that is degrading, which constitutes a violation of the Convention. In March 1979, only a few months after Tyrol's judgment, the complainants, an illegitimate child and her unmarried mother, you can see them in the picture, they complained inter alia that Belgian legislation violated their right to respect for family life and discriminated them contracting to the convention. So Ms. Paula Marx, being unmarried, gave birth to a daughter in 1973. Under Belgian law, no legal bond between an unmarried mother and her child resulted from the mere fact of birth. To create the bond, the mother had either to recognize maternity in specific proceedings or to adopt the child. But in both cases, the child's inheritance rights remained less than those a child born in marriage received automatically. The defendant Belgian government argued that the law favored the traditional family to ensure the full development of the family for objective and reasonable reasons related to morality and public order. The court noted that Article 8 of the Convention protecting family life does not distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate families, and that such a distinction would be in any case contrary to Article 14 of the Convention, which prohibits any discrimination based on birth. The court then stated that Belgian law places illegitimate families under unfavorable and discriminatory conditions. The court acknowledged that at the time of drafting the convention, so 1950, it was considered permissible to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate families. However, it stressed that the domestic law of the great majority of member states of the Council of Europe has evolved. And in line with relevant international instruments, the Council of Europe is moving towards full legal recognition of the principle mater semper certa est. So Belgium was convicted in 1979 of unequal treatment of extramarital children in the law of ancestry and inheritance. There is now an important difference between Tyrer and Marx. In the latter case, the court referred to two international conventions to indicate the existence of generally accepted standards. That is the Brussels Convention on the Establishment of Material Children and the European Convention on the Legal Status of Matrimonial Children. Although these two conventions, two international conventions were signed by a few contracting states only, the court noted that the existence of these two treaties means that there is a clear degree of common ground between modern societies in this area. The court also pointed out that Belgian law itself has indications of this evolution of rules and attitudes. In a series of subsequent judgments, the court did the same, examining the legal issue in question, making allegations about the purpose of the protected right, and in the light of present-day conditions, and detailing why state acts do not do justice to that purpose. An example of categories of people who were mostly considered less than equal in the 50s are obviously homosexuals. Regarding the right of homosexuals to enter the tenancy of the deceased partner, the court voiced for the first time in the case Kahner versus Austria. Although the plaintiff had a relationship with the deceased partner, shared an apartment with him and paid the maintenance cost, he could not inherit the right to rent the premises of the deceased partner. The court noted that any difference in treatment constitutes discrimination if there is no objective and rational explanation for it, that is, if it does not fulfill the legitimate purpose, or if there is no appropriate balance between the means employed and the objective to be achieved. In addition, serious reasons must be given to justify the differential treatment that is caused solely by the sexual area. The court emphasized that family protection in the traditional sense is a general purpose and that only a limited number of specific measures can be used to implement it. In areas where the discretion of the state is narrow, the principle of proportionality requires not only the measures chosen to be fit for purpose. It should also be shown that the exclusion of certain groups of people was necessary to achieve this purpose. So in that case, the court found that the government had not put forward any arguments for its position and had violated Articles 8 and 14 of the Convention. The position of the court in Karner case was considerably extended in the case of Kozak versus Poland. The court has examined the case of a homosexual claiming the inheritance of the right of tenancy of the deceased partner. So in this case, however, the facts were more complex than in Karner's case. The complainant and his deceased partner remained in a living relationship, but later separated for a few years and did not live together. The complainant claimed, however, that they had a live-in relationship again in the period before his partner's death. The case originally concerned the interpretation of the provision of Article 691 of the Polish Civil Code, which lays down the conditions under which a person who lives with a tenant may conclude a tenancy after his or her death. Let's recall, in present case, the complainant was a same-sex partner of the deceased tenant trying to use that privilege. The district court in Poland dismissed this application on the grounds that the relevant provisions of the civil code were not applicable to the situation of a same-sex couple. As a result of the appeal, the regional court ruled that the judgment was unclear and referred the matter to the Supreme Court. The problem stems from the development of the interpretation of the wording of the Civil Code provision, which originally referred literally to the coexistence of the spouses. After the amendment in 2001, a reference to the spouses was removed, and the right to inherit the tenancy was reserved for persons who stayed in the cohabitation with the tenant. Following this amendment, the Polish Supreme Court interpreted this provision as referring to couples who had lived together as if they were married. The court did not address this right to same-sex partners and ruled that in the absence of the relevant regulations regarding same-sex couples, the standards in the case law referring to the de facto relationship of heterosexual couples, that is concubinage, which were partly inspired by the provisions on marriage, cannot be applied analogically. So in the court's opinion, the inclusion of the cohabitating communities of people of the same sex were organized on the model of a heterosexual relationship in the concept of concubinage would be against the well-established tradition also in the linguistic sense. The case was then referred to the European Court of Human Rights. In its ruling in 2010, the court emphasized that the legitimate interest of a state in protection of family life and the institution of marriage cannot justify discriminatory sexual orientation measures, as it is the case in Poland. The court referred to its previous position in the Karnas case, pointing out that the state has some discretion in assessing the need for different treatment, but a blanket exclusion of persons living in a homosexual relationship from succession to tenancy cannot be necessary to protect the family in its traditional sense. The court also emphasized that given the fact that the convention is a living instrument that should be interpreted in the light of present-day conditions, the state should necessarily seek developments in society when choosing measures to protect the family and respect family life, and take into account changes in the perception of social and civic issues, including the fact that there is not only one way or choice in the field of private or family life. The court found that rights reserved to unmarried couples, in contrast to those reserved for married couples, must similarly include same-sex couples, as states have little room for maneuver to differentiate according to gender or sexual orientation. The court noted that the right to inherit the tenancy under Polish law is available to both a marriage and a concubinage. In court's opinion, the complainant and his partner lived in a concubinage, that is in de facto relationship. So for the first time, the court argued that a homosexual couple could have a family life. It is worth adding that the living instrument doctrine that is based on the open texture approach was also used by the United Nations Human Rights Committee and was also proposed in relation to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. A quite similar doctrine of living constitution, or the so-called loose constructionism, is present in the US constitutional law. It claims that the US Constitution and other constitutions have a dynamic meaning that evolves and adapts to new circumstances, even if the law itself has not been formally amended. The Constitution develops flexibly with the needs of the society. In the Canadian doctrine of constitutional interpretation, there is the living tree doctrine, also known as the doctrine of progressive interpretation. It comes down to a specific interpretation of the Constitution in the context of society, being open and reflecting the changes taking place in it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and that concludes the introduction to the opening of the Vienna Circle exhibition. Thank you to our online audience. Unfortunately, we have to leave you at this. Now, I would like to ask all our guests to move to the ground floor, or the level 0 of the library, for the opening of the exhibition itself. Now we have the background knowledge, and we can explore the exhibition. So thank you very much, and we will keep you posted on events related to the exhibition.